As the Japanese delegation stood on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, ready to sign the documents formally ending World War II, the scene was marked by an eerie mix of solemnity and demonstration of overwhelming power. High above Tokyo Bay, a massive formation of Boeing B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers swooped low, their presence a stark reminder of the destruction that had rained down upon Japan. The Japanese needed little prompting to recognize the devastation. The smoldering ruins of cities, the bombed-out rubble, and the perpetually smoking crematories were testimony enough to the horrors that had swept across the land of the rising sun. The national morale was broken. Nearly 70% of Japanese citizens interviewed by U.S. military personnel after the surrender admitted they had reached the limit of their endurance, unable to survive another day of war. While many Americans, particularly the young soldiers and Marines who had prepared to invade Japan's home islands of Kyushu and Honshu, believed that the atomic bomb alone forced Japan's surrender, the reality was more nuanced. By the time the Trinity test occurred in the New Mexico desert 2 months earlier, Japan had already been brought to its knees, devastated not just by atomic energy but by relentless firebombing campaigns executed from the bomb bays of B-29s, which had left cities smoldering and the population demoralized. The deployment of the B-29 had, by September 1945, become emblematic of American air power and its decisive role in Japan's defeat. Yet the story of the aircraft was not originally tied to the Pacific theater. Conceived initially as a weapon against Nazi Germany, the development of the B-29 began in earnest after the War Department issued an invitation for bid in the fall of 1940, anticipating America's likely entry into the European conflict. Persistent design challenges and production delays meant that the long-range bomber did not enter operational service until mid-1943, by which point its originally intended theater of operations had shifted. Commanders across the globe quickly recognized the strategic potential of the new aircraft, and demands for B-29s poured in, particularly from theaters where long-range bombing would be decisive. Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, the air commander for General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific area of operations, was especially insistent in requesting the bombers. Having been deprived of sufficient aircraft and trained crews due to the European theater's priority, and having personally overseen aspects of the B-29's development at Wright Field in Ohio in 1941, Kenney was convinced that these bombers could change the war in the Pacific. His vision entailed deploying the B-29s initially from bases in Australia and later from the Philippines to strike Japanese targets with precision and devastating effect. However, Air Corps Commander General Henry H. Hap Arnold had his own ambitions and ideas about the B-29's deployment. Despite his high rank, Arnold had never commanded troops in battle, and the advent of the B-29 presented him with an unprecedented opportunity to exercise direct control over a strategic air force from Washington, D.C. Rather than placing the bombers under the operational command of theater commanders like Kenney, Arnold established the 20th Air Force, a strategic bombardment unit under his personal supervision, charged with selecting targets and directing operations from thousands of miles away. This decision was as much political as it was strategic. It allowed Arnold to maintain control over one of the most powerful weapons in the U.S. arsenal, while simultaneously satisfying President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had long been eager to launch an aerial bombardment campaign against Japan. With Roosevelt facing re-election for an unprecedented third term in 1944 and pressured by political opponents, the initiation of B-29 raids promised not only a potential military victory but also a significant boost to the president's political standing. Through a combination of technological innovation, strategic planning, and political maneuvering, the B-29 thus came to symbolize the lethal reach of American air power and the complex interplay of military necessity and political calculation that helped bring World War II to its dramatic conclusion. The planning and execution of the early sustained bombing of Japan represented one of the most ambitious and logistically complex operations of World War II. Despite the B-29's impressive range, there were only 4 viable locations from which the bombers could strike the Japanese home islands. Soviet Siberia was immediately ruled out due to the Soviet Union's neutral stance in the war against Japan. Bases in the Aleutian Islands were technically within range, but the region's severe subarctic weather posed unacceptable risks to the untested aircraft. The Joint Chiefs of Staff saw promise in establishing bases in the Mariana Islands, a plan that strongly appealed to Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, because it heightened the strategic importance of the Pacific Ocean area, the sole region under direct U.S. Navy control. King also supported General Henry H. Arnold's proposal for an independent B-29 command, as it effectively prevented Douglas MacArthur from gaining control of the bombers. The option ultimately chosen by Arnold involved establishing advanced B-29 bases in China, a strategy that would allow air attacks on Japan to begin months before bases in Saipan and the Marianas could become operational. The operation also had a political and psychological dimension. It would bolster the morale of the Chinese, who had endured Japanese occupation and aggression since 1931. To lead this pioneering effort, Arnold appointed Brigadier Kenneth B. Wolfe, the project officer who had overseen the B-29's development and knew the aircraft intimately. Wolfe established the 58th Bombardment Wing Heavy at Marietta, Georgia, where the B-29s were manufactured, and began training the aircrews at Salina, Kansas. He then designed the operation code-named Matterhorn, formerly known as Early Sustained Bombing of Japan. The Matterhorn plan called for the bombers to be based initially in the vicinity of Calcutta, India, with forward operating bases around Chengdu, China, a plan that required moving enormous quantities of fuel, bombs, and supplies entirely by air. The logistical challenge of Matterhorn was staggering. All operations in China were dependent on air transport. There were no roads capable of supporting heavy cargo shipments over the Himalayan terrain or through enemy-occupied territories. Although the Air Transport Command already ran a supply route from India to China, Wolfe insisted that the XX Bomber Command remain fully self-sufficient. He organized it to include its own air transportation group, utilizing older consolidated B-24 Liberators converted into C-87 transport planes and C-109 fuel tankers. B-29s themselves were also repurposed as tankers to carry gasoline once they reached India, a remarkable adaptation that demonstrated both ingenuity and the sheer complexity of the undertaking. To preserve secrecy, the War Department propagated a misleading story, claiming that the B-29 program had failed as a bomber and that the aircraft were being converted into armed transports for service in the China-Burma-India theater. This deception was intended to mask the true capabilities and strategic intent of the B-29 fleet, though it is doubtful that Japanese intelligence believed the narrative. Despite the secrecy, the Matterhorn operation laid the foundation for the sustained strategic bombing campaign against Japan, demonstrating the extraordinary lengths the U.S. military went to in order to bring overwhelming air power to bear on the Japanese home islands long before the atomic bomb came into play. Operation Matterhorn's stormy start and the early B-29 campaign. Operation Matterhorn began under challenging circumstances, as the ambitious plan to strike Japanese territory from Chinese forward bases immediately confronted logistical and operational hurdles. The first B-29 to depart for India had taken a roundabout route via England, where it was put on display for propaganda purposes, creating the impression that the bombers were intended for use against Germany. In reality, the aircraft were being deployed to the China-Burma-India theater, with a forward mission to strike Japan itself. B-29s began leaving for India in March 1944, and by April, transport flights between Calcutta and the forward bases at Chengdu were underway. The plan called for the first combat missions to commence in June, yet early preparations quickly revealed the enormous logistical challenges involved. Wolfe and his staff had optimistically planned to airlift their own supplies, but it became clear that the airlift requirements were beyond the capacity of the bomber force alone. Consequently, the Air Transport Command was called upon to provide additional support. Supply problems were further exacerbated in May when Japanese offensives in China diverted resources intended for Matterhorn to the 14th Air Force, delaying the first strike. The initial B-29 combat mission, scheduled for mid-May, targeted the Makassan railroad yards in Bangkok, Thailand. Wolfe had hoped to fly the mission at night to provide his crews, who were still gaining experience in formation flying and operational coordination, with adequate training. However, he was overruled by Arnold and the 20th Air Force staff, many of whom had been veterans of the European theater, where daylight precision bombing was the norm. Wolfe postponed the mission and implemented a rigorous training program. By June 5, 1944, 112 B-29s were ready, though only 98 managed to take off on the day of the mission. The first aircraft crashed immediately after departure, and severe monsoon weather caused multiple cancellations, assembly issues, and disorganization. 14 bombers aborted the mission, and many crews struggled to locate their targets. Over Bangkok, the remaining aircraft operated largely independently, attempting to navigate through thunderstorms and heavy rain, with one navigator describing the confusion as Saturday night in Harlem. Despite minimal enemy opposition, the perilous return flight caused the loss of 3 aircraft due to fuel shortages and forced landings at numerous Chinese airfields. Overall, 5 brand new B-29s were lost, along with 17 crew members killed or missing, and post-strike reconnaissance showed only minimal damage to the target. Nevertheless, 20th Air Force considered the mission a qualified success, marking the beginning of a new phase in the air war against Japan. Immediately following this, Wolf received orders from Arnold to prepare a strike on a target in Japan itself by June 20th. Wolf faced serious logistical and operational challenges. Forward bases in China were running low on fuel and munitions, and he had originally planned a 100-plane mission for June 23. However, Arnold demanded an attack with 70 aircraft on June 15, pushing Wolf to escalate airlift operations over the hump, the treacherous Himalayan supply route. The target was the Imperial Steelworks at Yamata on Kyushu, chosen to signal to Tokyo that the war was closing in. On June 15, Wolf dispatched 92 B-29s to the Chinese forward bases, though 9 aircraft arrived with mechanical issues. Only 68 could take off on the day of the mission, and a series of accidents and mechanical failures reduced the attacking force to 63 bombers. The first plane reached the target just before midnight, but visibility was hindered by smoke, haze, and intentional blackout procedures. Only 15 crews were able to bomb visually, while 32 relied on radar bombing, a relatively unrefined technique at the time. Despite strong Japanese anti-aircraft and fighter defenses, not a single B-29 was damaged over Japan, though one was lost on the return flight to China. Overall, 6 bombers were lost during the operation, and 55 airmen were reported missing. Damage to the steel mill was minimal, yet the psychological impact was significant, alerting the Japanese people for the first time that their homeland was now within the reach of American air power. Following this mission, the War Department officially announced the existence of the 20th Air Force, making headlines alongside the Normandy invasion. Arnold emphasized the need for sustained pressure on Japan, despite logistical constraints. The immediate objectives included attacks on steel mills in Manchuria, harassing raids on Japan itself, and strikes against oil refineries in Sumatra. Wolf submitted a plan for a 50-plane mission against the Anshan Steelworks, but Arnold sought more aggressive action. Shortly thereafter, Wolf was reassigned to the United States, promoted to Major General, and placed in command of the Material Command, a maneuver that allowed Arnold to install a more assertive commander to continue the strategic bombing campaign. Operation Matterhorn Stormy Start highlighted both the extraordinary complexity of long-range bombing operations in the China-Burma-India theater and the determination of the United States to strike directly at the Japanese heartland. Despite early setbacks, mechanical failures, and severe weather, the B-29 campaign established a foundation for the relentless aerial assault that would ultimately contribute to Japan's surrender. Operation Matterhorn under Saunders. Early missions and challenges. With Brigadier Kenneth B. Wolf reassigned, responsibility for the XX Bomber Command and its ongoing Operation Matterhorn fell to Brigadier General Laverne Blondie Saunders, who had previously commanded the 58th Bombardment Wing. Saunders assumed command at a critical time when the B-29 campaign against Japan was still finding its operational footing. On July 7, 1944, a formation of 18 B-29s conducted a harassing mission against Japanese positions. Operational difficulties quickly became apparent. 1 aircraft aborted, while 2 were forced to turn back due to fuel transfer problems, although the remaining planes successfully bombed a Japanese depot at Hankow in China. Despite the limited results, the mission marked Saunders' first foray into command, providing important lessons on the logistical and operational complexities of the campaign. Encouraged by early successes and aided by favorable weather and a productive month for the Air Transport Command's hump operations, Saunders decided to prioritize an attack on targets in Manchuria by postponing a planned mission against the Palembang oil refineries. Nevertheless, he faced a persistent shortage of operational B-29s, partly due to the conversion of several aircraft into tankers to support ongoing logistics. To maximize operational readiness, Saunders proposed halting transport operations 10 days before the planned raid and moving the bombers up 5 days in advance. While 14th Air Force Commander Major General Claire Chennault opposed this plan, fearing that the concentration of bombers in China might provoke Japanese attacks, Washington approved it, and the feared assaults never materialized. Out of 111 bombers dispatched from India, 107 reached China. Heavy rains forced the attack to be postponed to July 29, and despite weather-related delays, 72 B-29s managed to take off, with 60 eventually reaching the target. Bombs fell slightly upwind of the intended target, smoke from fires drifted across the mill, and enemy fighters attempted to engage the formation, including one curiously marked Curtiss P-40 from the Chinese-American composite wing. Nonetheless, the mission proceeded without loss to the aircraft over Japan, though one was lost on the return leg. Matterhorn's 5th and 6th missions, conducted on the night of August 10, 1944, demonstrated a more ambitious dual-pronged approach, with simultaneous strikes on the Palembang oil refineries in Sumatra and the docks at Nagasaki. The twin operations were made possible by reducing the number of bombers allocated for Palembang. Washington had initially requested a daylight strike with 112 planes, but fears of heavy losses led to a decision to attack at dawn or dusk with half the force. A further strategic innovation involved the mining of the Misai River, a critical shipping route for the refinery complex, which was executed successfully by 8 B-29s from the 462nd Bomb Group flying beneath a 1,000-foot ceiling. One crew was forced to ditch, resulting in a single casualty, but the operation successfully impeded Japanese shipping. Meanwhile, the Nagasaki mission, with only 24 bombers, proved notable for Technical Sergeant H.C. Edwards achieving the first officially confirmed B-29 aerial kill of the war against a Japanese plane. Despite heavy flak and reports of 37 Japanese fighters, not a single B-29 was damaged, illustrating the growing effectiveness of the bomber crews and their defensive gunnery. Saunders' operations, however, were not without internal opposition. Major General Chennault, senior air officer in China, argued that strikes on the Japanese steel industry were ineffective and diverted scarce transport capacity. Chennault proposed that Matterhorn either shift focus to the aircraft industry or withdraw to India. Disregarding these objections, Saunders continued to plan attacks against steel targets, emphasizing the strategic importance of undermining Japan's industrial base. On August 20th, a coordinated strike involving 75 B-29s targeted Kyushu, Japan. Operational challenges continued. One group was delayed due to a crash blocking the runway, and the mission faced intense Japanese opposition. 61 bombers managed to reach the target, but 4 were destroyed by enemy action, and 3 more were lost in what may have been a deliberate ramming attack, where a fighter collided with the tail of a B-29, causing cascading losses. The 462nd Group adapted by lightning loads for a night attack, allowing 10 bombers to reach the target with minimal opposition. Overall, the operation was costly. 14 bombers were lost, and 95 airmen were killed or reported missing. While XX Bomber Command believed the steel targets were damaged, Japanese records suggested that the effect on industrial output was minimal. Despite the setbacks and high losses, Saunders' leadership ensured that the B-29 campaign from China continued to pressure Japan, laying the groundwork for the strategic bombing operations that would follow. The missions highlighted the complex interplay of logistics, weather, enemy resistance, and political considerations that characterized Operation Matterhorn, and demonstrated the resilience and determination of the American aircrews committed to striking deep into the Japanese homeland. Synchronous bombing and the evolution of B-29 operations. As Operation Matterhorn continued, Brigadier General Laverne Blondie Saunders had begun to stabilize the XX Bomber Command's missions, but a significant change in leadership was imminent. Major General Curtis LeMay arrived to assume command, bringing with him a reputation for rigorous discipline, innovative tactics, and uncompromising efficiency. Saunders' next planned attack on Manchuria was flown as scheduled, with LeMay accompanying the mission to observe the crews in action. The attack inflicted substantial damage on the Showa Steel Works, signaling the potential of the B-29 in strategic bombing. Observing the operation closely, LeMay decided to implement sweeping changes to improve efficiency and maximize the impact of future missions. He altered the basic bomber formation from 4 planes to 12, creating a wider bombing pattern, consolidated smaller units into fewer, larger squadrons to reduce support personnel requirements, and introduced a new synchronous bombing policy. Under this method, one bombardier would focus on radar tracking while others attempted to acquire the target visually, thereby increasing accuracy under difficult conditions. Despite these innovations, the days of Matterhorn were limited. The XX Bomber Command would fly only one more mission against a steel target, another attack on the Showa Works, which failed to inflict any significant damage. Subsequent missions shifted focus to the Japanese aircraft industry and airfields on Formosa, while mining operations in rivers and harbors became a primary responsibility of the B-29 fleet. In December 1944, the command executed a mission that Brigadier General Claire Chennault later regarded as a turning point. Chennault had long advocated for incendiary attacks on the Japanese supply depot at Hankow in China, but his appeals had been ignored until Japanese forces in the region mounted an offensive that threatened Allied bases. Supported by Lieutenant General Albert C. Wiedemeyer, the new commander in China, Chennault pressed for a B-29 attack, which Arnold approved despite LeMay questioning Wiedemeyer's authority, since the B-29s were based in India. The Hankow mission marked a significant success. Although it was not the first B-29 incendiary operation, the first experimental missions from Saipan in November 1944 had achieved limited results. The attack on December 18 involved 84 B-29s as part of a larger 200-plane mission. Even though the initial formation dropped bombs upwind, the mission destroyed 40 to 50% of the docks and warehouses, with only 38% of bombs used. Chennault reported that Hankow had been rendered militarily ineffective, demonstrating the potential of coordinated incendiary bombing to cripple Japanese logistical hubs. Meanwhile, the U.S. effort in the Marianas was gaining momentum. On October 12, 1944, Brigadier General Haywood Possum Hansell arrived on Saipan in the first B-29 to reach the islands, followed shortly thereafter by Brigadier General Emmett Rosie O'Donnell, who established the headquarters of the 73rd Bombardment Wing. Originally slated for Matterhorn, the 73rd was reassigned to the Marianas after the fall of Saipan, reflecting the strategic shift toward long-range operations from island bases closer to Japan. Hansell, a strong proponent of precision bombing and a veteran of the B-29 program, faced immediate challenges. The wing suffered a severe shortage of aircraft, with planes scattered across the Pacific and only 2 to 3 arriving per day, far below the initially anticipated 5. The first mission flown by the XXI Bomber Command targeted Truk in the Caroline Islands, a former Japanese supply hub that had already been significantly weakened by Navy carrier aircraft and B-24 raids of the 13th Air Force. The initial sortie of 18 B-29s in October demonstrated the operational challenges inherent in long-range bombing. 4 aircraft aborted the mission, including Hansell's command ship, preventing him from flying a combat mission in his own B-29. Shortly thereafter, his successor, Brigadier General Lauris Norstad, invoked a regulation prohibiting the commanding general of a very heavy bombardment command from flying over enemy territory. Despite these setbacks, the groundwork was laid for the XXI Bomber Command's eventual focus on sustained high-intensity bombing from the Marianas, paving the way for the next phase of the strategic air war against Japan. B-29 success rises. The struggle for precision and command. Once combat operations against Japan commenced, Brigadier Generals Haywood Possum Hansell and Emmett Rosie O'Donnell found their authority for mission planning increasingly curtailed, as the 20th Air Force in Washington assumed primary control over target selection and operational directives. The first mission directive focused on destroying Japan's aircraft industry, a continuation of the XX Bomber Command's campaign, while the newly operational XXI Bomber Command targeted locations beyond the reach of B-29s flying from Chinese bases. Interestingly, the city of Tokyo itself was not initially a primary target, although several of its aircraft factories in surrounding suburbs were. For maximum propaganda impact, 20th Air Force selected the Nakajima Hikoki plant at Musashino, a suburb of Tokyo, as the first high-profile objective. Though the plant produced more than 30% of Japan's combat aircraft engines, its selection was driven largely by the anticipated headlines, "Tokyo bombed." The mission was to be executed in daylight using precision bombing methods, a strategy reflecting Hansel's steadfast belief in accuracy over mass incendiary raids. Despite plans for the strike being submitted in October, aircraft delivery delays pushed the operation to November. The first B-29 over Tokyo was actually a reconnaissance model, an F-13 piloted by Captain Ralph D. Stakely. 17 reconnaissance sorties, 8 dedicated to weather observation, preceded the raid, and 1 aircraft was lost to enemy fighters during a mission over Nagoya. Hansel's operational plan, codenamed San Antonio I, relied on intelligence assessments of Japanese fighter strength around Tokyo, which significantly overestimated the threat. While estimates suggested 600 to 1,100 enemy fighters were stationed in the Tokyo area alone, in reality only 375 operational aircraft defended the entire nation. The initial raid was scheduled for early November, coordinated with Navy carrier strikes 5 days prior, but the Navy postponed operations due to complications in the Philippine Sea, forcing Hansel to proceed independently. The raid was eventually set for November 17th, but heavy rains and shifting winds delayed it for another week. On November 24th, favorable weather finally allowed the mission to proceed. General O'Donnell led the formation from Saipan, with Major Robert K. Morgan, the famed pilot of the B-17 Memphis Belle, serving as his co-pilot. Of the 111 B-29s that took off, 17 aborted, and 6 others failed to drop their bombs due to weather complications and strong jet stream winds, leaving only 24 aircraft to strike the target. Despite these obstacles, the attack was more effective than initially believed. Japanese records confirmed that 48 bombs struck the Nakajima plant. Physical damage to the facility was minor, and fewer than 150 casualties were reported. Nevertheless, the raid carried enormous psychological weight, signaling to Japan's civilian leadership that the war was increasingly unwinnable. In response, Japanese planners began relocating production underground, although no such facilities were fully operational by the war's end. Missions against Japan's aircraft industry continued into January 1945, yet results remained disappointing. The treacherous weather between Saipan and Japan, where frigid Arctic air collided with warm Pacific currents, produced severe thunderstorms that challenged the B-29s both en route to and returning from their targets. Most strikes inflicted only minimal damage, with the exception of a December 13th raid on Nagoya, which successfully damaged an engine factory. Meanwhile, 20th Air Force increasingly pressed for experimental incendiary raids, a strategy Hansel opposed, believing precision daylight bombing offered superior long-term results. The success of the Hankow incendiary mission on December 18, however, forced a strategic shift. Hansel reluctantly conducted a test incendiary attack on Nagoya on January 2, 1945, but just 3 days later, Brigadier General Loris Norstad arrived from the United States to relieve him. Ironically, Hansel's final mission as XXI Bomber Command commander validated his entire approach to precision bombing. On January 17, 1945, a formation of 73 B-29s attacked the Kawasaki aircraft plant at Asahi, dropping 115 tons of high explosives. While U.S. intelligence initially estimated only 38% of the facilities were damaged, post-war Japanese records revealed that 90% of the plant had been destroyed, prompting Kawasaki to cease operations entirely. This mission demonstrated the potential of daylight precision attacks, proving Hansel's theories correct. Yet despite this remarkable success, it came too late to preserve his command, as strategic priorities and political pressures favored the emerging doctrine of mass incendiary bombing under Curtis LeMay. Heavy casualties. Inconclusive results. The early firebombing campaign. The arrival of General Curtis LeMay as commander of the XXI Bomber Command initially brought only incremental changes to operations, but he quickly began reshaping the strategic approach to bombing Japan. On January 23, 1945, LeMay requested permission to strike more lightly defended targets to reduce B-29 losses, but Brigadier General Loris Norstad advised him that an incendiary raid on Kobe would yield more significant results. Understanding the importance of political and military expectations, LeMay planned a massive raid on Kobe, scheduled for February 4, 1945, which was intended to be the largest of the war to date, with bombers from two wings participating for the first time. Despite initial plans for 157 aircraft, logistical difficulties, mechanical issues, and aborts reduced the formation to just 69 planes by the time it reached the target. From high altitudes, the B-29s dropped 159.2 tons of incendiary bombs and 13.6 tons of fragmentation bombs. Approximately 200 enemy fighter attacks were reported during the mission, resulting in the loss of one B-29 and damage to 35 others. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs revealed major damage to Kobe, and Japanese records confirmed the destruction or severe damage of 1,039 buildings, leaving more than 4,000 people homeless. Civilian casualties were moderate, though the psychological impact of the attack was significant. Following the Kobe raid, attention shifted to the Nakajima aircraft plant at Ota, where Japan was producing the new Ki-84 Frank fighter. The Ki-84 was a highly capable high-altitude interceptor and represented a growing threat to the unescorted B-29s. In spite of limited bombing accuracy during the raid, with only 7 incendiaries and 93 high-explosive bombs hitting the factory, damage was substantial. Fires ignited by the few incendiaries destroyed 37 buildings and 74 newly manufactured Ki-84 fighters. The B-29 losses during the operation were heavy. 12 aircraft were shot down and 29 others damaged, underscoring the continued vulnerability of unescorted bombers in daylight raids against Japanese air defenses. While the raids inflicted measurable damage on military targets, the results remained inconclusive for American planners who were seeking a decisive impact on Japanese industrial production. Washington remained committed to an aerial firebombing campaign, pressing LeMay to intensify attacks despite mounting casualties and uncertain results. By February 25, 1945, LeMay had scheduled a massive incendiary assault on Tokyo, employing over 200 B-29s in a single coordinated effort. Of the 231 aircraft that took off from Saipan, 172 successfully reached the target and dropped a total of 453.7 tons of incendiaries. Weather conditions over Tokyo proved challenging. Heavy cloud cover forced bombardiers to rely on radar to release their payloads, reducing precision. Despite this, the raid wrought devastating effects on the city, destroying roughly 1 square mile of urban area. Japanese records later confirmed that more than 28,000 buildings were destroyed and thousands of civilians perished from the firestorm and smoke inhalation. The raid illustrated both the destructive potential of the B-29s under LeMay's leadership and the steep human and material costs associated with the early phase of America's strategic firebombing campaign against Japan. Firestorm in Tokyo. Civilians become targets. In early March 1945, General Curtis LeMay confided to his public information officer, "This outfit is getting a lot of publicity without having accomplished much in bombing results." That would soon change dramatically. The 20th Air Force had concluded that precision bombing was largely ineffective against Japan, particularly given the nature of Japanese urban construction, which consisted of densely packed wooden buildings and narrow streets. The strategic focus shifted decisively toward firebombing cities, a decision that reflected a significant moral and strategic recalibration in the United States. Deliberate attacks on civilian populations, previously considered unacceptable, were now justified by the Japanese government's own announcements that all men up to age 60 and women to 45 were being mobilized to defend the nation, effectively blurring the line between civilian and combatant. LeMay saw this as license to target urban areas with the expectation of crippling both industrial capacity and civilian morale. LeMay also introduced radical changes in tactics. He scheduled missions at night and at lower altitudes, reasoning that Japanese anti-aircraft defenses were disorganized and far less accurate than those encountered over Europe. To maximize payloads, many B-29s were stripped of defensive machine guns, allowing them to carry more incendiaries. New bombing methods were devised. Lead squadrons would mark targets with napalm-filled bombs to ignite fires and attract Japanese firefighters, while the main bomber formation, delivering M69 incendiaries, would drop in tighter intervals for greater concentration. Each crew bombed individually, ensuring a continuous, overlapping barrage. For the mission on March 9, 1945, a total of 334 B-29s were assembled, the largest formation to date, so massive that it took 3 hours for all the aircraft to become airborne. Despite encountering heavy clouds and turbulence en route, navigators used radar to find their checkpoints, and over Tokyo, weather conditions were favorable. Pathfinders successfully marked their targets, allowing the main formation to drop their payloads at staggered altitudes between 4,900 and 9,200 feet. Strong winds fanned the fires, producing a rapidly expanding conflagration. The targets were not solely industrial. The main focus was the thousands of homes and small buildings that supported feeder plants and local infrastructure. The dense wooden construction facilitated the spread of flames as if the entire city were dry brush. Fires rose to terrifying heights, with heat intense enough to obliterate anything in its path. The human cost was staggering. Citizens attempted to flee the inferno, seeking refuge in rivers and canals, yet the heat was so extreme that in shallow areas the water literally boiled. Panic swept through the streets, and countless men, women, and children perished as they tried to escape the flames. Radio Tokyo labeled the attack slaughter bombing, likening it to the burning of Nero's Rome, though the destruction inflicted upon Tokyo far surpassed that ancient devastation. The psychological impact was immense. Japanese morale plummeted, and the peace faction within the government gained influence. Those who had previously been prepared to fight to the death began to reconsider their resolve as the reality of overwhelming American air power became apparent. B-29 losses were higher than usual, but still lower than previous missions, validating LeMay's decision to fly at lower altitudes. Nonetheless, he chose to rearm the bombers for future raids in anticipation of potentially more effective Japanese night fighter defenses. Nicknamed Old Iron Ass, LeMay became infamous for his uncompromising strategy and relentless focus on crippling Japan's cities. The March 9 firebombing of Tokyo marked the beginning of a sustained campaign of devastation that would not only physically destroy Japanese cities, but also erode the will of a nation to continue the fight, signaling a grim new chapter in the aerial warfare of World War II. By bombing alone, the final campaign against Japan. On the afternoon of March 11, 1945, a massive formation of 313 B-29 bombers lifted off to strike Nagoya, one of Japan's key industrial cities. Of these, 285 successfully reached the target, yet the destruction was not as severe as the catastrophic fires that had consumed Tokyo just days earlier. Bombardiers spread their incendiary loads over a broader area, and the relatively light winds over Nagoya failed to fan the flames into the firestorm that had obliterated the Japanese capital. Nevertheless, the success of Nagoya was only a precursor to an even more devastating mission. As smoke still rose from the Nagoya raid, 301 bombers began a mission against Osaka, a major city that had so far escaped American bombing. Despite numerous aborts, 274 planes reached the city, where cloud cover obscured much of the target area. Bombing via radar led to a closer concentration of incendiaries, resulting in a massive firestorm that consumed 8 square miles of the city's core, including critical commercial and industrial sectors. The results from Nagoya and Osaka confirmed that Tokyo's destruction had not been an isolated event. It was a harbinger of what could be achieved with sustained firebombing. LeMay continued to fly incendiary missions, completing 5 operations before the kamikaze crisis during the invasion of Okinawa necessitated a temporary diversion of B-29s to strike Japanese airfields in Kyushu. The success of these missions convinced LeMay that Japan could be forced to surrender by bombing alone, without the need for a costly invasion of the home islands. On April 25, he wrote to Norstad to express his belief, a sentiment shared by other senior figures. 2 weeks earlier, Colonel Cecil Combs, director of plans for the 20th Air Force, had recommended ramping up firebombing immediately after Germany's surrender. Former U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Joseph C. Grew, had also advised President Truman that Japan was on the verge of capitulation. Even high-ranking military leaders like General Douglas MacArthur and General George Kenney concurred, reinforcing the idea that aerial bombardment alone might bring Japan to its knees. For nearly a month, the strategic bombing campaign slowed as 75% of XXI bomber command missions focused on tactical objectives. Most strategic missions during this period involved high-altitude precision bombing with conventional explosives, but LeMay managed to conduct several firebombing raids, including 2 targeting areas around Tokyo Bay. By late May, he had amassed enough resources to launch raids with over 500 aircraft, and by mid-June, the cities encircling Tokyo Bay were reduced to smoldering ruins. Phase 1 of LeMay's urban bombing campaign concluded on June 15 with spectacular results. Japan's 6 largest cities had been devastated, its industrial infrastructure shattered, and over 1 million civilians had suffered casualties, with hundreds of thousands killed outright. The capture of Okinawa brought additional forces into play. B-24 liberators from the 5th and 7th Air Forces joined B-29s in the incendiary raids, while North American B-25 Mitchell struck Kyushu in preparation for the planned invasion in November. Naval aircraft from carriers, along with Army fighter bombers operating from Iwo Jima and the Ryukyu Islands, further intensified the aerial assault. Japanese civilians experienced the most intense and sustained bombing campaign in history, and their morale began to crumble under the relentless pressure. On July 26, 1945, President Harry Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender. While many Japanese officials were willing to accept, a few cabinet members objected, fearing the emperor's fate and branding former government leaders as war criminals. In the meantime, American bombers dropped leaflets warning of impending starvation, a realistic threat for a country reliant on food imports. By August 4, reports from 5th Air Force pilots indicated that white flags were being waved across Kyushu, a clear sign of a population on the brink of surrender. 2 days later, the first atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima. Popular mythology credits the atomic bombs with Japan's surrender, but in reality, the nation was already demoralized and on the edge of collapse. The new weapons had limited immediate effect. Most Japanese were aware only that a terrible new bomb had been used, with few understanding its strategic significance. Truman's warnings of a reign of destruction merely reinforced the already undeniable power of the Allied bombing campaign. On August 14, the Emperor addressed the Japanese people for the first time in history, announcing the nation's surrender, bringing World War II to an official close and demonstrating that Japan had been bombed into submission long before the atomic age made its terrifying debut.